Hey everyone. I will ask if you can mute all your microphones, and if you have a question, put it in the chat, but you'll see a little chat icon on the bottom. When we get to the Q&A, I'll go through that and try to answer all those questions. So feel free to put them in there, but I won't answer them until we get to sort of the Q&A part of the talk. I'll do the whole screen. And let's start with some slides. Everyone loves slides, right? Can everyone see my slides? Oh, I told you to mute. Oh, that's fun.
Yes.
Okay, good. So we're going to start by talking about Vue. I normally would ask you to raise your hands if you've used Vue or not, and I'm not going to know the answer to that today. So I'm going to just assume that it's fairly new to you. And one of the ideas here is Vue is another framework for writing client-side web development. And we'll talk about why I think it's sort of in a different space than some of the other guys. I have a slide with who I am, but we already covered all that. So let's go beyond that. And let's talk about SPAs. Now, SPA, or single-page applications, I think are they're overused. They're often used to create these monolithic sort of enterprise apps in a lot of organizations. And in my mind, this often this often is a good use case for it, but I think the idea of one giant app is just overused. I fought for a long time against the phrase single page app because it sort of implies that the best practice is that you're going to have one giant app. And I thought we had learned back in the Visual Basic days that having one giant app isn't really the appropriateness. And I just hated the idea that we were taking these giant VB or other sort of thick client apps and just turning them into giant SPAs. JavaScript in some ways was never meant to handle the sheer amount of code we're talking about. And so I like to talk about more the consumer facing or the websites that are more interactive where we can add those. Single page apps often want to replace web navigation, and that is useful, but it's useful up to a point. If we're going to replace it all with this one giant app, I'm kind of against that idea. And SPAs also usually want to centralize services. And so my opinion, as you probably figured out, is I think they're typically overused. SPAs work really well when it's just forms over data, which is a lot of the work we do, but it isn't exclusively there. SPAs also work really well for dashboards, but crowbarring a SPA into the replacement for your website feels silly to me, feels unnecessary. So that's where I think Vue fits into the world pretty well. So Vue itself is different from Angular and React in that it's trying to present both being able to build large applications as well as handle the small applications. And my experience with React and Angular is that it's hard to do the small piece. So Vue is built so you can sort of incrementally scale up as you get bigger. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's just JavaScript or TypeScript, and is great when a full SPA is just too much in your application. So I'm not here to say you should stop using Angular or React. I'm really not. I think Vue fits in a place that's sort of in the middle of them. Angular is sort of focused on these large enterprisey apps. React is super component-based, but still requires a lot of magic to happen. And Vue sort of sits in the middle. And let me talk about what this looks like in my world. So in React, you have some code you have a JSX compiler, usually something like Babel or TypeScript, package it all with Webpack, and then you can have code that you can deploy to the browser. Same is really true of Angular, maybe a little simpler because you're not using JSX in most cases, but you still need a build step for JavaScript. Vue supports just using a Vue library and your code in more of the traditional way that we built client-side apps for a long time. But as you get larger, you can decide to use TypeScript, Babel, or whatever, even Webpack, as you can achieve the benefit of a larger application using things like type safety and tree shaking and some of the other things, but they're optional. They're not required. And you can gain some benefit from wanting to use them. And I'll show you examples of both today, but you don't have to. And so the philosophy here is all about scale up. The other thing that Vue wants to do is get out of the business of doing things that are not its responsibility. So things like making calls to the network, across the network, Vue doesn't do for you because it knows that there's other libraries, whether you're using jQuery or using Axios or one of the 400 NPM packages that do it, you're going to do it there separately. Same with validation. Even routing, even though it has its own routing module you can use, it's not even requiring you to use its. And its routing module is a separate thing you can import into it. The core of Vue doesn't include routing. Has recommended extensions for each one of these, but you don't have to use their recommendations. So I feel like it's a little less sort of buy-in into the way you would use it. And so what Vue does is support declarative rendering, component-based composition, binding in the kind of typical ways you would think, things like single file components, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then a way to extend it. The idea behind Vue, I wrote an article, I guess it was last year, that talked about replacing your jQuery with Vue as one path of let's get rid of code that's untestable and let's bring in code that is testable. And jQuery is notoriously untestable, whereas writing something against Vue and writing tests against Vue becomes pretty simple. The ecosystem of Vue isn't as large as React or Angular right now, but it's really, really large. And it's one of the trending projects on GitHub right now. So it's one that, you know, if you're not using right now and you're using one of the other client-side application frameworks, I would just keep your eye on it to see whether it fits into your use cases or not. So let's write some code. That's almost all the slides I have. We're going to spend most of our time actually in Visual Studio. So I have this really simple website. I'll just run it real quick. And right now it's using all server-side rendering. If I go clockwise, sometimes it speeds it up. Wish I could hear people laugh, but it's a funny joke. And so we have this little website. I'm like like a bed and breakfast that has a couple of rooms that you can book. And I don't have anything this really wired up. It's just some data I have on the server, and I'm showing it. And one of the ideas behind not needing spas is, you know, ordinarily you might think, oh, this would be a good spa, and then when they book now, we'll take them to this page in my spa, and then I'll take them to the payment page and all that sort of thing. I would say that one of the things you really want to do when you're thinking about architecting websites, especially consumer-facing websites, is to break it up into a bunch of small spas. That's why I like the idea of multiple page applications, because you have these little bit of spas that do something significant. Like this spa might only display the rooms available and be able to do the logic of, is it available, what the prices are, whatever it may be. And then when someone clicks book now, it may take them to another page on your web server that then is a spa that will handle booking and picking which room and showing calendar and all of that. That doesn't need to be one giant spa. And this is a place where I think Vue does this very well. So let's replace this. Let's start by just talking about what Vue is from the ground up, and then we'll get into something more complicated. So I'm just going to open up my Vue. And you can see this is a typical ASP.NET Core Razor page. There's nothing magical about it. We're doing all this in sort of server-side rendering. And I'm just going to create a quick place to put something just so we can see it work. And there's also a section here for scripts, because I'm going to need to inject some scripts on the page for JavaScript. The first one I'm going to inject is actually, I'm getting Vue from node modules. And you can look at this code later if you're into ASP.NET Core to understand how I'm using Vue modules. But I'm basically getting Vue, and I'm just going to include Vue as a script. And I'll need to clean this up a little. This code will be available afterwards, so don't worry too much about trying to copy every little piece of it. The drag and drop still doesn't work with node modules as well as I'd like, so I'm going to do a little fix up. So we've got Vue included on the page. So this is already different from some of the others where we need to actually compile it. And then I'm just going to create another script tag, and I'm just going to call JS index.js. I'm just going to write a little JavaScript to do what I want to do on this page. So let's go and do that. In my www root, I'll just create a JavaScript index.js file. I like to have that at the top. And all I'm going to do is create a new Vue object. Because I've included it on the page, all I really need to do is write, oh, I'm not going to, that's the C# syntax, is write a new Vue object and tell it where to mount it. So I'm actually going to say dot mount, and I'm going to give it an element or selector. And so in this case, I'm going to call it the app, right? This is just a CSS selector of where to put my Vue object that I'm going to write some code in. And so we'll just put a ID the app, right? And so what we're doing is taking over this part of the app and wanting to write code that sort of handles it. We do that in Vue 2 by passing in an object. And this object has sort of an interface for how you want to expose things. And the first thing you're going to see is something called the data element. And this is the data that we want to be able to display on the page. And so I'll do something simple like name, right? Anything that's part of this data object, I can simply use curly braces or mustache syntax, if you prefer, to be able to get at and show that element on the page. You know, I certainly could have just typed it in, but we're getting composition of what is showing up on that page by putting in our properties themselves. And let's just see if this works. Come back here and refresh the page. We can see my name is there, right? So far, it's not all that interesting, but let's expand it just a little, and let's put a button here. And I can use Vue syntax to say I want to be able to handle the click event. And so this v-on is a prefix that it's using and looking for to say, oh, this is going to be handling an event, and this is the name of the event, and then I'm going to call something on my Vue object. And I'll just say on click for lack of a better name. Let me fix that L because it's going to bug me. And so another section we can put in here are methods. And what is one of those methods? On click, and this is just a function body. So what are we going to say? We're going to say this dot name equals Bob, right? Nothing all that interesting. Or more interestingly, maybe, is this dot name plus, let's just add underscores to it. So we can see that when our code changes the underlying data, that the page is just going to react to that. And this is a core idea of what it's trying to do. It's trying to expose some sort of data that then can be data bound just in HTML. That what is represented here for our UI is pretty simple. This v-on syntax can actually be shortened to an @. Because we're in a Razor page, I actually have to do double @ because the @ sign is also used by Razor. So I usually leave it as v click on, but if you're using another backend, that becomes pretty obvious to do. And so we can do the same thing with attributes. And the way we do that is v-bind, and let's say title, and then just put that name. So we now have a title element here. And this v bind can actually be shortened to just colon as well. So we start to see that the difference between what we would normally type in here and type in here is pretty simple. And so if we go back here and look, we let it build again. How are we doing on time? Oh yeah, plenty of time. If we hover, we'll see that the title is now shown as well. And if we change it, it'll change it everywhere, including in that title, right? Because we're doing this two-way data binding. We're binding to the page, but also letting the page re-render every time that data changes. So you can see that this could be used for sort of simple manipulation, and you could imagine it on things like, what's the word I'm looking for? Contact pages and simple forms to do things like validation. And this will give you, a client-side experience for the user instead of having to go to the server to find out whether things are valid. But as you scale up, let's talk about the scale up part. Because instead of using it raw, what we can do is I've actually built using the Vue CLI. I'm going to open up a browser, a console real quick. Make sure I'm in the right folder. Yeah. In the client CLI, in the client folder, I've actually used Vue, which is the name of their CLI tool, and I can do things like build or serve or other things to go ahead and build the application in a more, I don't want to say more modern way, but it's actually a build step. And so you can see it has its own package.json that has its own scripts that we can run, as well as the dependencies, and then the dependencies during development. And it will build all this for you when you create a new project with the Vue CLI. I just didn't want to, because there's a lot of package downloads, I didn't want to have to do that in front of you. And so what we end up with here is a project that just builds into our www root folder. And inside source is all the code that we have so far. And there's not a lot of code here. All that this main does, and you notice we're using more ES6 and beyond because we're using a compiler to compile it back down to ES5 for browsers, that we can use some of this more complex and more modern way of doing things. But what it's really doing is really not that different. What it's doing is actually saying create a Vue object, and then this app.vue file is going to be what's going to be shown in it. I'm still mounting it in the same place. I'll call it the app since I changed the name. And what happens on this index is, instead of these two files, I'll comment them out so that you can look at them later. When we build this project, which we can do at the console by just saying npm, and I'm actually going to use, npm run watch. It's a script in npm that says build the project, and then every time I make a change, rebuild it again. And so this becomes our cycle of, these are the two files we need, and anytime I make a change to the code, these will be regenerated. So it becomes a pretty simple way to rebuild, run, rebuild, run. And so this has built these files in an app folder for me. It's the app.js, and I just need to bring these in, the vendor files first, and then your code ends up in this app.js. Instead of index, it's app. And so we can actually, this will all be overwritten, as well as the title. So let's actually just comment this out, and let's make this ID equals the app. So we're going to take over this whole section, and I'm going to actually just comment out all the server-side rendering, because we're going to actually replace that in a minute, and I'll show you how. So what is this app.vue file, right? So one of the benefits of using Vue as well is this idea of a single file component. And so what this allows us to do is have 3 sections in here. You can have a style section that is scoped to just what you're working on. You can have a template, which is the HTML that's going to be injected into the app section, and then you have the code that's going to manipulate it. So you have this one file that you can sort of work with. This isn't a requirement. If you'd rather keep .html files and script files separately, you can certainly do that. I just, after sort of being against the idea for a long time, I've sort of embraced the idea here. And you can see the format is pretty close to what we had before, except we're just exporting a default because we're using a compiler to do this. So let's see if we can get at least the template showing up in our application now that we made this change. If I refresh, I go clockwise to speed it up. So we can see our simple UI is now working. Of course, it's not interesting at all, right? So let's do a couple of things. Let's introduce a method called mounted. Mounted is a special method that says when my component is mounted on the screen, run something. And so I'm going to actually use mounted here to load up the data to store in rooms here, right? And so what we're actually going to need to do is use something for the networking. So I'm going to just bring in Axios, whatever that latest version is, and let Visual Studio get it for me. Actually, I might need to, I always forget that I need to npm install here. We'll let it do its work while we do this. And so what are we going to do? We want to use Axios to get an API in the server. Our server already has a controller for this called rooms. And so we're just going to say get API rooms. And because we're writing in code that is being compiled, we can do things like async and await, right? It starts to simplify a lot of the code we might write here instead of having callbacks and nested everything. And then I can just say this dot rooms equals result dot data. Because this object that I get from Axios has a bunch of information in it, but the actual payload of the data is this data element. And so this code, if you've done this in uncompiled JavaScript before, you know this can be a lot more complicated with promises and other asynchronous sorts of pieces. This becomes incredibly simple when we do this. And by assigning the rooms here, we're essentially saying, here, go ahead and fill the rooms. Actually, I forgot assignment doesn't work for collections. I have to actually push it into the collection. And how would we go ahead and show these? Let's do a quick div for 8 column offset MD8. Can't remember which version of Bootstrap this is using. I'm hoping those are right. And then we'll just create another div and we'll use another attribute from Vue, and that's for. And here I can just say for R in rooms, because rooms here is part of the data element and it is a collection. And we'll go ahead and just say r.title, I think is what it's called. So as a very brief review, when it gets mounted, we're going to load this data, and then we're going to go ahead and show the title of each of the rooms that's in the server. And I broke everything. Oh, Axios isn't defined. Yeah. That's my fault. Because we changed the packages, I actually have to rerun the build. Nope. Yes. Already had this. Oops. Over here. Try it one more time now that it's actually building. Oh, yeah. I always forget. So here I have Axios, and it's not defined anywhere because we need to import it. Again, this is more ES6 syntax. If you haven't used it, it may be a little more confusing, but it should look a little bit more like you would imagine your C# code, right? Let's try it one more time. Nothing in the console. Did the network fail? There's rooms. It said it got it. Make sure I didn't forget to build the database, the response. And it is called title. It's always easy until you know how, right? So let me see. I probably don't have it installed. Let's do a little trick here just to make sure I didn't do anything wrong. I'm going to force the debugger to stop for me. So there's the result. So it must be in my syntax. If it went well, you'd all be surprised, right? V4 in rooms. Make sure it's actually rendering correctly. You're in the right project. Always easy once you know how. It's showing the rooms, but just not finding them. Well, let's do what I always have on backup. If you've never seen me speak, you'll know that I always have the cooking show version. Someone probably has the fix for me, but I'll get to that chat in a minute. This will have a little bit more of the application in it, but I'm sure I did something weirdly wrong here. But what I've done here is basically taken that markup that we had. Is there a question?
Sean, is there anything we have to put inside the Vue page once we done the .vue file? Something? No, I'm not sure. I'm just guessing it. Like.
Yeah. I'm going to show you the working version instead.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
So what I've done effectively is, if we look at the index file, sorry that we had to sort of pull up a pre-built one. You'll remember that I had all this code that was server-side rendering. I took the same code and brought it over here. And I've added the V4 so that we're actually going to show the same code, except we're using this client-side syntax. I'm binding the source of the picture, the title, the description, all of that. And so the same things you might do on the server with Razor, you could do by defining it in the template. And so let's try running this one. Oh, and I remember what's wrong. There's something wrong with the. I upgraded it from 2.2 to 3.1, and there was actually a rendering problem. So this version will work. We're actually getting all of this information from the database now, right? The URL to the images, the data. So this should look exactly like what you saw before. But of course, if we look at this object, we'll actually see, and this is sort of an indicator that we're using Vue in here to repeat these. If we had changed something on the server, we could change that. But what's interesting to me is we basically replicated what the server was doing, but let's add some functionality. And what I did here was create that book button, But in this case, I'm going to use that client-side onClick to call into our code. And what does onBook do? What's interesting about the onBook here is it actually passes in the room. So I don't have to figure out which of these they clicked on, because just like I am using the R variable to represent the room that's being bound, I'm doing the same thing in the click event. And so here, I'm just actually, there's a little selected element that will change. Let's get rid of that. To say I've selected the varsity, I've selected the Omni, which you can see up here on the page. And so we're being to add some functionality to the page by interacting it and keeping all the code in this sort of one space. The reason this is interesting to me is that I can then take this code that's in here, this class that is exported here, and I can write tests against it, which would be really difficult to do in other cases. But it also means that I can do it in a very minimal way if I need to, and then scale up to something larger and larger. And this may look like we're going to have one giant piece of code, but often a lot of this code is actually being hidden by creating components. So I've created a weight cursor component here, and let me just show you what that looks like. That's just another Vue file, and it has properties that I can bind to. I can set values to, and then I'm using them to show the alert if we're busy and to show the message here. And let me just show you what that is before I start to take questions, because I know there's a few questions. Because I've brought in the weight cursor here, I then just have an element here called weight cursor, right? This is an actual component that I'm using attributes to set the properties by. So here I'm saying, go ahead and use please wait for the message instead of loading. And then here, because I have a colon, I'm actually binding to the is busy. Is busy is happening. Unfortunately, my network connection's so fast, you're not really seeing it happen. But what happens on the is busy is that when I call out to the server, I'm showing this as busy here. And then when it's done, I'm turning it back off. And so this change of data is actually changing the code on the page. If we run it a few times, you might see it flash, but I doubt on a Zoom connection you'll be able to, because it's really, I should put a delay in there so you guys can see it, but you'll have to trust me, it works. Especially when you get it on your own computers, you'll be able to see it. And so often these applications are going to be built by creating components and components and components like you might be used to in React. But it's Vue is different for me in that it's allowing you to be either shallow or really deep, allowing you to create a simple one-offs where it's just the browser and a couple of JavaScript files, or you want to get down into using the Vue CLI to build an entire larger application. And this example will be available on my website once I blog about this later on tonight. So you will be able to get all this code pretty soon. Let's talk about one more thing, and then I'll start taking questions. Where's my slides? So Vue 3 is about to launch. It's actually in beta right now. And when they say beta, they mean beta. They're releasing a new beta about every day or two. So it's a very quick cycle of changes, though most of the API changes are solid. Version 2 isn't going away, and a lot of the features that are in 3 are either available now in 2 or will be backported to 2. So 2 it certainly isn't going away. They're not forcing everyone to upgrade. But the idea about 3 is to mature the library, to borrow some ideas from React that I thought were a good idea, and then add some new features like a composition API, which is a little easier to write than this Vue object syntax we saw. Adding full TypeScript support, moving away from having global objects, and fewer of these properties that start with the $, which are sort of these magic properties that they propagate. I have an article coming out soon that talks about all the new features, and Vue probably won't ship a release, or at least a release candidate, until later in the fall. So it's imminent, but it's not here quite yet. So let's see if I can answer some of these questions. To open up the chat. So I'm going to say your name wrong, but Hedel said, can we bind data from model? And when you say from model, I'm not sure what you mean. If you mean from the server-side models, no, you'll need to expose APIs to call from this code, just like you would from any JavaScript. And there was another one about having to do anything on the Vue page to get the result. What I showed here, and I'll try to be more specific about it, is by calling the API here, you should get the result. And we could take a look at this result and make sure it's okay. Like we could check for the success code. Like if I was writing more bulletproof code, it would be more like if result.status code equals 200, right? Then I would do this and I would handle errors in a more graceful way. But in a demo, I wasn't going to necessarily do that. If other people have questions, you can turn on your mics and I'll see if I can answer them. So there's a question about transitioning from jQuery to Vue. And so the transition code-wise requires a sort of a leap of faith into understanding binding. jQuery is about manipulating the DOM directly, and Vue is about manipulating data that reacts and having the DOM react to it. So they're skill-wise, it's actually not a huge leap, but concept-wise, it can be if someone has never worked in a binding sort of library before, whether that's in JavaScript or even in writing client side. This is very similar to sort of the way that like MVVM works, and XAML is very close to the way that most of the big client side libraries work. But once you're able to get that switch to move from jQuery to something like Vue, you'll never want to go back. The idea of actually manipulating and injecting actual elements everywhere you need instead of using these tools to do it, I think you'll be a lot happier because it becomes less fragile.
So I got a question, Sean. So it's looking great. Being able to start small as well and scale up and build on top of this. Let's just say you're starting with a brand new project. Is there a reason to not use Vue for single page applications?
No, there isn't. So if you're if you're starting with a new application and you're starting from scratch, using Vue and probably using the Vue CLI to build that application is useful. One of the things that I wasn't able to show, but for me is a big win, is inside the Vue config here, you have the opportunity to have it build a bunch of small applications as well. So instead of having the one giant application, you could have from this one code set, have it create, they call them pages, but individual apps that share some code, but Webpack is building them as an individual app. So you could have one for your sales page and one for your HR page and one for your whatever it is, without having to repeat this client structure over and over again in case you had more than one. And it's one of the things I really love about it. Essentially, it's just pages, and then it takes an object where you say the name of the project, and let's say app, and then you give it main.js as the starting point of that app. And then you could add more like hr.js, and they become the starting point for your Angular app, and it will build that that JavaScript that has all the shared code, and then a small version of each of these that you can deploy separately and version separately and whatever you need to do. And so that becomes very compelling for sort of the multiple single page application model that I like.
Interesting, thanks.
Other questions? Let's see if there's anything more in chat that I missed.
I have a quick question, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, great, what you just showed us, what you demoed us, this is wonderful. So, as you probably know, Blazor is another UI framework from Microsoft, that is gaining a lot of traction.
Mm-hmm.
In every conference, every major conference, there's always there's always a topic on Blazor, including the one recently with the build. So I guess my question is that now, using Blazor, we don't really need, JavaScript or any JS, framework per se. Although it complements if you, want to use a JS framework. Now, can you think of a use case where you could use Blazor and Vue at the same time?
To me, and I've talked about this before, it's a little controversial the way I view Blazor. But Blazor to me is for skill set, not for you would be using Blazor based on your company's skill set way more than you would be based on your company's application requirements. Blazor has issues with startup time and probably always will, just because it's effectively downloading a WebAssembly version of WebAssembly version of the framework. And so if you're in a company that just either doesn't want to or has no interest in learning TypeScript or JavaScript, Blazor is a great solution. I just think right now, and probably for the foreseeable future, you're going to find that the client-side frameworks are going to probably scale better and have better performance, at least startup performance. The runtime performance should be similar. The reason I mention all that is, in my mind, and again, I've said this a bunch of times, Blazor is for shops that don't want to leave web pages, ASP.NET web pages. And this is a bridge to get them into the client side while still using C#. So I think they are competing technologies. I think that once you get comfortable with JavaScript or TypeScript, that there isn't any real, difference in productivity, functionality. I mean, I think, especially with TypeScript, you're going to get really comfortable. And I think you're going to see there are paradigms that you learn from TypeScript and JavaScript that you wish C# had as well. And so it's a bit of me leaning on the idea that C# isn't the one best tool for every case. But I applaud Microsoft for building Blazor, because I think Blazor is going to fit into those shops where there just is there's no desire to learn anything but C# and .NET.
Oh, excellent, thank you.
There was another question I didn't get to. If you want to implement authorization and authentication and authorization, this would be, Vue would handle it in the same way that any client-side application would do it, and that would be with tokens of some sort, probably JW tokens. And because Vue is agnostic to how you make your network calls, it doesn't actually deal with it directly. It relies on you putting a header inside the calls to Axios and things like that. I do have an example. There was another question about, do you have a version that shows this? And yeah, there's a GitHub repository out there called Core Code Camp. It's the source for the Atlanta Code Camp website, and we've done exactly that. We're using Vue to create multiple small spas for each of the different pages. There's about 5 of them or 6 of them that we use, one for admin and then a number for the call to speakers and some other things that we're doing. So I'll include that in the I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Sure. When I blog. And thanks, Rob. He's probably gone already. And I don't really have one that is a booking and payment spa. I haven't broken out this particular example into a bunch of spas, but I think you'll see the way that spas could communicate with each other or have them for different parts of your website by looking at that Core Code Camp. Other questions before we take a break? Great. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope everyone has as good a time as I did.